Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Ray. I am one of the co-creators of the film Guardians of the Grasslands, along with my business partner and brother-in-law, Ben Wilson. Together, we make up the team of Storybrokers Media House. This evening, we're really excited with the response we've had, and we're so thankful and gracious that all of you were able to make it this evening. We're sure that you're going to have a thought-provoking evening, and we're really excited for the panelists that we will have join us in a few minutes. To start, there's just a few things that we want to tell you about that will help to make your experience tonight really engaging and one that we hope is robust. If you are new to Zoom, in the top of your screen, you will see a little setting that says view. You can change how you see the screen in that area. The second thing to know is that we will be hosting a panel discussion after the film, and we will be opening it up to questions from the audience. If you wish to participate in that, you can go to the Q&A function in Zoom, and you will be able to ask a question, and we hope to have a lot, so we will try to get as many in as possible. And then the last thing is we have an incredible team with us this evening, and we are going to have them using the chat function to send out further information for all of you who want to have any more information, like myself, to take back home with you. They'll be giving extra resources, and most importantly, the film will be shared in that location at 6 o'clock this evening for you to share with your communities or with your friends if you choose to do so. So to start this off this evening, we're actually going to start by introducing our panelists. What excites me most about filmmaking and about the work I do is that I get to speak to some of the most brilliant minds in our country. These people are passionate, they are knowledgeable, and they're people I truly admire. So to start, I'm going to ask each participant that I introduced, each panelist, to introduce yourself, your organization, and what the work you guys do, and then also share maybe one of the things that you love most about the Canadian grasslands. So to start, we'll start with Carla Gwynn, who is part of Ducks Unlimited Canada.
Hi, good evening, everybody. So I'm Carla Gwynn, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and Ducks Unlimited Canada is a national charitable organization. We've been around for 83 years, and we focus on wetland and associated habitat conservation. Myself, maybe a story about me and grasslands is I really attribute my passion and love for nature to spending time roaming around the grasslands of my grandparents' ranch in southwestern Alberta. And I have very fond memories, and I truly believe that it helped form the person I am today.
Next, we will introduce Ben Campbell, a rancher and the owner, alongside his wife, Steph, of Grace Right Grass-Fed Beef. So Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ben Campbell. I'm a rancher from Southern Alberta. We have a direct market business, and we produce a few different things. I think my favorite thing about the grasslands is, as a rancher, being in them. I used to be a full-time engineer in the city, and I quit that so I could just do what I love. And my favorite thing in the whole world, I think something that really grounds me with the kind of person I want to be, is in the evenings, like 8 o'clock at night on a summer day, I go out into the field when all my work, if all my work's done by then, and just sit and be still and enjoy the cattle and the grass and the bugs and the birds. And I just am just present in it. It's sort of a meditation place for me. It's really a part of who I am.
Yeah, and as somebody who has been to your ranch, Ben, that's not a hard thing to do. It's a beautiful place. The next person up is Catherine Grenier with Nature Conservancy Canada.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. So I'm with Nature Conservancy Canada, Canada's largest land conservation organization. Essentially, we make conservation happen, but we don't do it alone. We do it with partners, landowners, donors, all levels of government, ranchers, Indigenous communities, a very wide range of partners all across the country. We've secured over the 60 years we've been working over 14 million hectares from coast to coast to coast. And if I'm talking about a personal thing, I want to share a bit of hope because I am a full Easterner. I'm born and raised in Quebec City, and I've grown a big love for the prairies because of the stories that people like Ben and people I work with every day have been shared with me, and how I now value the importance of the grasslands for all of us in Canada, but for the world. So I think this biodiversity heaven is something that you could learn to love. And by sharing stories like the movie we're sharing today, the great work Sarah has done, I think we could grow way much of a bigger community to support for the grasslands, and the grasslands needs it. So happy to be here, Sarah.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think that that's a perfect segue. And somebody I'm really excited to have join us today is Steve Lee, who is a climate activist and executive director of Foundation for Environmental Stewardship. I think this is an important person to have on the panel and perspective. So can you please introduce yourself, Steve, and share one of your stories of what you love most about the grasslands?
Yeah, thanks so much. My name is Steve. I'm now with the Major Group for Children and Youth, which is a stakeholder group for children and youth voice throughout the United Nations. And the organization that I was with, the Foundation for Environmental Stewardship, which is a youth-led, youth-serving sustainable development charity, continues to operate. And I had recently published its agricultural report based on the last project we did before the pandemic, where we traveled across Canada, mostly in rural and remote communities outside the cities, to visit over 500 schools and over 400 towns to really look at humanity's exponentially changing relationship with machine, nature, and biology. So and through that tour is how I got to meet the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, and they had arranged a tour for me to visit a whole bunch of ranches throughout the country, right from the Atlantic to Alberta. And I remember visiting this really pristine native grasslands in southern Alberta, and just going up the hill and looking down, and I literally lost sense of time and space for a few minutes. Apparently, I just looked outside, like out into the grasslands, and spent several minutes in complete silence. And yeah, it was one of those life-changing moments that I look back from the entire tour across Canada. So yeah, that's my relationship with the grasslands.
Well, that's really incredible, Steve. And for myself, I think this is a perfect segue into how Guardians of the Grasslands actually came to be. So it's a really interesting story, and it really starts back in early June 2019. Ben and I were on a location filming young ranchers and chefs together. And we were fortunate enough to be in the presence of a really passionate woman called Christine Taffley, which you will see in the film. And she does work with Ducks Unlimited, and her love of the environment, of ranching, and of habitat is just contagious. What I loved most about that whole day was our conversation we had with Christine, where she described really some incredible things I had no clue about, and it shocked me. The first one was that Canada is home to one of the world's most endangered ecosystems. That shocked me. I had no clue. And somebody who really pays attention to both environmental issues and then obviously land issues, I was really shocked by this. But the second thing that she mentioned in that day, and it really stuck with me and was something that really was important to me, was the fact that in Canada, we have to look at beef production a little bit different and the role that the cattle play in our own environment. And so it's really important that we look at the context of what they mean to our own ecosystem. And really that's where where this idea came to be for this film. We left that day and I said to Ben, if we ever get an opportunity to do this film, we have to do it. And it just so happened, as luck would have it, 2 weeks later, we were on the Waldron Ranch doing a story about their incredible history. And we looked around, and may it be divine intervention or just pure dumb luck, we ended up having absolutely every party at the table that was needed to do the film, along with this beautiful grasslands to shoot it on. So we sort of cornered Jill Harvey and begged her to let us do this film. She gave us her blessing, and we are so grateful she did. This film was meant to be something that you take with you, and you engage in a conversation that all Canadians need to be a part of. I want to just read some of the things that this film has done. It's gone to 25 film festivals. Some of the most notable being the Elements Environmental Film Festival in Vancouver, Oakville, Ontario's Caring for the Climate, Wildlife Conservation Film Festival in New York and Los Angeles, and the Nature Without Borders International Film Festival. It's won 6 awards in 6 different film festivals for Best Research, Best Directing, Best Cinematography, Best Editing, and Best Short Documentary. And most importantly, it has been hosted in over 300 private screenings across Canada, the United States, South Africa, and Australia. So without further ado, we would like to introduce you guys to the film Guardians of the Grasslands.
Walk down the street and ask any Canadian to name the world's most endangered ecosystem. Chances are they'll say either the rainforests or the coral reefs. These 2 ecological hotspots are the focus of international campaigns to protect biodiversity.
Well, the international community has been making its opinion clear.
They're the subject of social awareness campaigns through the news and social media. As you walk down grocery aisles, you'll see products with logos about protecting marine life or rainforests. And chances are your favorite restaurant has started offering paper straws. There's no denying the impact we are having on the planet. And with all this increased awareness, you may be surprised to find out that one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world is actually one we have right here in Canada.
Here in Western Canada, we have less than 20% of our native grasses left. In some areas, that number is as low as 13%, which is really sad because you think of the cultural significance that these grasslands have for Western Canada, first the Indigenous peoples, and then the settlers that came out. Everybody talked about the prairies as being a vast inland sea of grass. And honestly, if you've ever had the opportunity to spend an afternoon in a grassland when the wind is blowing and you hear it swishing, you would think that you're in a sea. But it's disappearing, and it's disappearing at a real alarming rate.
The loss of Canada's native grasslands is also a loss for the world. Humans depend on nature for our very survival, and the loss of grasslands creates major environmental issues such as flooding, loss of wildlife habitat, and a reduction in soil carbon sequestration.
In healthy native grass, there can be over 100 different plant species within a 5-acre radius. Not only are there plants, but there's a lot of different wildlife.
There's more than 80% of Canada's species at risk that depend on grasslands. By losing our grasslands, it's actually going to be extremely impactful on the majority of our endangered species.
Basically with grass, what they say is that you've got what you have above ground, you also have below ground. So if you have grass that looks like this above ground, then you also have roots that look like this below ground. But with native prairies, it's like threefold, where the roots really extend deep into the soil. The benefit of that is there's 2 cycles of carbon, and the above ground stuff every year in the spring, like right now, it's sucking carbon from the air and producing plant matter above ground and below. But all the stuff above ground gets cycled back into the air again usually by the end of the summer, or for sure by the next year. The stuff that goes into the ground is the roots, and that stuff's what becomes really stable and long-lasting in the soil. And that's how they build organic matter here. So this ranch, is 65,000 acres, and it sequesters, currently right now, there are approximately 2 million tons of carbon, which is the equivalent to the emissions from over 100,000 Canadians for a year. So that is stable, long-term, and permanent in the ground as long as we have an intact ecosystem and cattle grazing on it.
Over the last decade, the story of cows and the environment has been a hot topic, but the narrative has been focused on cattle's contribution to climate change and the destruction of the rainforest. The idea that cattle could be integral to the health of an ecosystem is a very different story. In order to understand the real impact of cattle on a specific ecosystem, we have to look at the context.
The context is so important. We're not standing in a rainforest, we're standing on the Canadian prairie. And so in that context, we need grazers. And we need a livestock industry to keep the prairie, what's precious left of it, where it is. And so in our Canadian context, let's think about what's most sustainable for here.
So what role do cattle play in the grasslands ecosystem?
What happens is the glaciers came and wiped off all the topsoil, so we had no life. There was nothing here, and it grew topsoil down into the soil. I always thought that topsoil grew up and it was an accumulation of something, but topsoil actually grows down into the dirt, and it's just a conversion of inorganic, dead rock and silt and sand into actually this dark black life, which is like an Amazon rainforest, but underground, where you have little tiny T-Rex predators, and they're going around and killing other things, and prey animals and parasites, and it's a whole complex web underground, an ecosystem that's alive. And by having cattle here, they're creating that life. They're the keystone species in this ecosystem. It was the bison before them, and the bison completely built this into the ecosystem that we have today, and built all the topsoil and sequestered all the carbon. And when they disappeared, these grasslands became sick, and they needed to have another keystone large herbivore grazing on it.
When a keystone species is removed from a habitat, all other species are affected, and some may disappear from that ecosystem or even become extinct. Without the presence of a grazing species on the grasslands, there's a devastating impact on the natural production cycle of the grass.
In the fall, that top growth dies and the root underneath the soil stays growing. But because the top growth has died, if it's not grazed and removed, what happens in the spring is it gets harder for the new growth to grow up through it. So the grass actually ends up starting to smother itself and all of the other species around it. So really, you need to have the grazers on there that are helping to remove and eat off some of that growth so that it can start regrowing again in the spring.
Without ranchers to keep these wide open spaces intact, we wouldn't have these amazing iconic landscapes. The families that own these ranches, it's been in their family for generations. They genuinely care about the land. And there's a really direct correlation between healthy land and healthy cows. Ranchers know that if they take care of the land, it's going to benefit, the whole cattle production industry. And so there's this really symbiotic relationship between cows and native grassland.
There's no better example of this than the story of the Grasslands National Park. Parks Canada, in hopes of preserving the prairie land and saving it from being plowed and turned into cropland, had their own ideas in 1988 about what would be good for the grass, and that did not include grazing. This created friction between Parks Canada and the local ranchers, who argued that grazing and disturbance were critical to healthy native prairie. For 20 years, much of the grass lay idle, grazed only occasionally by wandering wildlife. So what happened after removing cattle from native grasslands? The grasslands lost its biodiversity, and tame species of grasses such as crested wheatgrass began to take over. This also impacted wildflowers, pollinators, and the homes of birds that nest in the native grasses. Fortunately, Parks Canada listened. They researched and worked closely with Saskatchewan ranchers, conservationists, and scientists to bring cattle back to the national park in order to benefit native birds and other species.
We need that grazing impact. So when we think about the grass that we see here, when we have a grazer come along and bite those plants and create an interesting and dynamic canopy structure in that grass that creates homes and types of homes for all kinds of birds and all kinds of other animals, and lets light down to the soil surface to let different types of plants grow and compete, and all of those things add to the biodiversity and these bio-rich communities that we have.
There's deer and elk and grizzly bears and worms and all sorts of things in here, and if you were to cultivate this and grow lettuce, you would have to get rid of all of those other things, whereas cattle just share the ecosystem. They don't use it completely, they just share it with everything else, and that's what's really special, is that cattle are able to be a part of the ecosystem without damaging it, but actually to benefit it.
While the native prairie ecosystem is a pretty tough ecosystem, it can survive a lot. The one thing it can't survive is being broken up. When the native prairie is plowed or tilled or converted for other uses, even if it's only used under those different uses for 5 or 10 years and then seeded right back down to grass, it never comes back in this part of the world as true native prairie.
When the Canadian prairies were settled, a large portion of the native grasslands were lost to the development of cities and towns, construction of highways, and the plowing of land for growing crops and other uses. With 74% of Canada's native grasslands now lost forever, preserving what's left is critical. Working with ranchers to help manage the grasslands by using domesticated livestock to graze the land that bison roamed for thousands of years may be able to preserve this precious resource for future generations. Right now, we have a choice, but if we wait until it's gone, there won't be a choice left to make.
I heard a quote once, and it talked about the extinction of a species. And it's a very, very powerful quote, because it said, is a species extinct when there are no longer any species left on the planet? Or are they extinct when there are so few that can't hear each other calling to each other? So could you imagine that, being an animal that calls this place home, and there's so few spaces left that you can survive, that you can't hear any of your mates calling? So, you know, the thing is being in conservation, you kind of have to be an eternal optimist, and I'm very optimistic, and I really think that these are beautiful landscapes. They provide so much to humans, and I think we've all come to a spot in our civilization where we're starting to realize that we depend on nature and we really have to live in symbiosis with it. So I really think that there's a lot of hope for these grasslands, that if enough people start to care about them, we'll never have to wonder if they go extinct or not. I hope you guys all enjoyed the film. I'm going to dive right into the panelist discussion. But before we do that, I would just like to remind everybody who's maybe new joining right now that if you would like to ask a question, you can simply go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom and ask your question there.
So to start, I'm actually going to start with Steve. He was actually one of the first people who saw the film outside of the people who are actually involved in making it. I'd love to get your experience, Steve. At the same time that we were making this film, you were actually on the road traveling around talking about environmental issues with students in schools. And I'd love to understand, what was your first impression after seeing the film, and then also traveling to the Waldron and seeing just how vast the grasslands are?
Yeah, I didn't know I was one of the first people who saw it, so that's quite exciting. This is about I think the fifth, sixth time I've watched this, and yeah, every time it helps me reflect better on what precious inheritance we have here in Canada. And so a little bit of background about me is I was born and raised in South Korea and moved around to different countries. Then I came here to London, Ontario for high school, then stayed in the big city in Toronto. And then I basically lived on the road for 3 years out of my car, visiting place to place. And my background is on global international development and policy work at international levels, and I'm the typical big city, this elitist kid. My family background is not necessarily that, but that's the impression. And as I was visiting these places, it was very different. The ranches I visited were very different from cattle operations I had visited in Australia or in Brazil or in India or Pakistan. It was very different to the extent that I could not believe that this is the average ranches that I'm being shown. I figured the first few ones that the Cattlemen's Association must have picked the best odd ones to show me, so that I would be duped into thinking this is all for a sustainability show. And the more I looked into it, the more people I talked to, the more I realized that Canada really is an exception to the global rule. And even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report and the Oxford study that looked at the beef production's GHG emissions, it actually has asterisks, and it singles out Canada as an exception to the rule. And that's a story that's not actually told. It's very hard to understand how vast the grasslands really are, and the importance that the grazers and the carbon sequestration that the grasslands have on this effect. So yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, and just to further that, because there was something that was really interesting to me, Steve, when I've heard you speak before, can you give sort of an indication for the viewers who are watching, how much potential is there for carbon sequestration in the grasslands currently?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've walked around with all these stats, but the current carbon that's stored in the Canadian grasslands could be valued at 4.3 billion Canadian dollars if it's priced at $15 a ton.
Wow, yeah.
Of which $11 billion has already been lost because of conversion. And this is just putting economic sense to it, but I mean the potential for this is enormous. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices recently produced a report showing kind of what are the big kahuna climate solutions, a high risk, high reward one. And there's direct carbon air capture and different things. Then there's this big circle, and that's agriculture. Of carbon sequestration, and that's actually hard to do. It's hard to measure, hard to roll out that kind of policy. But if it does, my God, it's one of the big kahuna solutions that only Canada can produce.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. We have a whole bunch of questions coming, and I want to tackle this one first because, and I'm going to actually turn it over to Carla and Catherine. maybe you can both answer this one. When we toured this film across all the different festivals, this is one of the most common questions we got asked. And I noticed the audience is asking this question also. To give a little bit of an indication and background on the film itself, the Waldron itself actually has cattle and sheep that they use to help manage the grazing management of that land. And there are some other species also in other places in Saskatchewan that have been using buffalo too. So the question we get asked most often is, why not just turn buffalo back out into the wild and let them do their job? And I would really like to talk about that a little bit. Buffalo and all grazing animals actually can play this role too. However, what's the feasibility of using buffalo like they were naturally in the wild, or if not buffalo, using the wildlife today that we currently have to actually play the role that the cattle are currently on the grasslands? So maybe we'll start with you, Catherine.
Well, sure. I mean, there's been lots of experiments done everywhere, but I think the idea is you need to have the grazing to keep the grass at different heights. And I think the cattle has been demonstrating is benefiting the ecosystem quite a bit. I think what we found through with the absence of actual grazers through the Grasslands National Parks experiment, it really highlighted for you that just having regular wildlife was simply not enough. So you need actual active grazing all the time to maintain our native prairies.
And how about with you, Carla? You guys work so closely with ranch families also. Is that a feasible option to use wildlife instead of grazing animals, may it be cattle, sheep, or buffalo, as an option to manage grasslands in today's current environment?
Yeah, so I mean, to protect the grasslands, has been pointed out in the film, you do need large herbivores grazing the land in order to keep that grass healthy. And as you point out, there are wild animals that offer similar benefits, and bison used to be one of them. But the fact today is that the majority of our working landscape that contains the grasslands is actually under private ownership. So most of it is privately owned. So with grasslands increasingly threatened, we need to use the best solutions in front of us now, and solutions that will work with today's farming realities. And the best solution to stopping the loss of grasslands and wetlands today in an environmentally and responsible, economically viable beef industry. Without a healthy beef industry, these critical habitats will be rapidly developed or converted to other uses. It's just probably unrealistic to think that we're going to tear up all the fences and just let, herds of thousands of bison roam the prairies again. It's probably just not realistic at this point.
That could get interesting in Calgary.
Yes.
Okay, well, awesome. Before we tackle a lot of the other questions from the viewers, I just want to actually talk with Ben Campbell quick. Ben has a really interesting story, and he had actually mentioned this a little bit in his introduction, but Ben's a friend of ours, and he has an interesting background where he didn't necessarily grow up directly on the farm. He had family who was ranchers and who are actually pretty close to the Waldron, but he came back to it, and he was into acting, engineering, and then became a rancher. So before we dive into the questions from the viewers, I'd really like to ask you, Ben, as somebody who found the passion for food and came back and said, I want to do this myself now. What was your experience when you came back, or what was your understanding, rather, of what it means to have that delicate relationship between environment and ranching? And how important is that to maintain a balance between those two things for the success of your ranch?
I guess my understanding, well, I guess I'll start back. Yeah, so I was originally... basically, I grew up on an acreage on the farm, and I wasn't involved in farming or farm work really at all. I didn't know anything about agriculture. I have a degree in engineering. When I finished university, I went to Africa and worked for Engineers Without Borders. And all I knew when I came home was I didn't want to be a cog in the wheel of a big company. And I ended up doing that because when you're an engineer in Alberta, that's what you do for a while. But I wanted to find something that made the world a better place, that both impacted people. I two core values, which was helping people and helping the environment. And I stumbled upon ranching sort of as a way that can do both of those. And so it allows me to achieve my life goals of reconnecting people to where their food comes from and to a healthy way of living, and also doing something that's good for the environment. In terms of how important the balance is of nature, I can't overestimate how important it is. I'm really I say that my place is like my own. It's like a national park, but just for me. And I'm a park ranger, and all I do, the cattle are just a tool that I use to harvest the grass. We have pigs and chickens that graze as well on the grass, and lots of wildlife. And balancing that is my whole job. That's all I do, is check the grass all the time and dig holes and check the health of the soil and do soil health tests. And I'm testing for water infiltration rates and water holding capacity and organic matter and the ratio of fungi to bacteria. Like, that's what I'm actually doing. I'm not out there roping cows and branding and that's not what I'm doing at all. So all I'm doing is really acting like a conservation person, is to the best of my abilities. And I don't know nearly enough. And that's my life goal, is to learn as much as I can. But that's all I do is balance an ecosystem. And for the most part, I just try to stay out of the way.
Well, I think that my kids can appreciate that, Ben. My son's first 4-H speech was about how his dad will go out and lay on his belly looking at cow poop. So totally understand that. We're going to move to some audience questions. The first one is from Adam, and it says, beautiful documentary. Is someone from an area of the country not able to appreciate these lands, but also interested in seeing them one day? Are there opportunities for ecotourism in visiting them? And I'm not sure, Ben, you might have some ideas with the Waldron if there's opportunities to see that ranch, or what's more local in your area, because myself, I'm not actually sure.
I think it's one of our most undeveloped resources that we have is ecotourism. Not in like we have agricultural tourism, but quite a lot of that's focused on like cropping. But agricultural tourism or ecological tourism on the grasslands, I think, could be something that would be really huge. If we did, would have to be done either entirely or in partnership with Indigenous people. I don't know. It's one of our best resources in Canada. It's something that's incredibly unique and special that we have. That's rare to this place and nowhere else in the world. So there's currently not a lot of opportunities for that. But I think look at the background picture there, the Waldron Ranch. I mean, I just go for walks there, and it's beautiful. My friend is the manager, and I would, if I was from the city, I would pay to walk around there.
Well, I have to say, as for myself, I have grown up in the country my entire life, and it's just breathtaking when you see those lands and just how big they are. When we filmed, there was a rain shower and thunderstorm all across the Waldron, and we could drive for 20 minutes, still be on the ranch, and miss the shower. So they're vast, they're beautiful, and they're just so incredible. However, I do want to encourage people, even if you're not able to travel to the grasslands, everywhere across Canada, you can experience ranches like that. And a lot of ranches have tour days or open farm days that you might be able to access. And it's really incredible experience to see how involved ranchers and farmers are with the environment and really with their communities. So I encourage you all to go check that out. The next question I'm going to
maybe
actually
Sarah, if I could just add to that, because I
Catherine.
totally agree with Ben, and I think there's more to be done there. And I think if people want to go and check NCC's website, Connect to Nature, it actually highlights some of the places we could go and visit some of those ranches in Alberta specifically, as well as across the country. So and highly encourage people to go and visit, because firsthand experience is the best way to learn about those great stories and share the love.
Totally is. And Catherine, I think that you guys maybe have some volunteer opportunities at points too, do you not?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I mean, with the pandemic situation over the last year, some of that's been reduced, but we're really looking forward to bring more people back on the land and connect people to nature to see how they could get involved to make a difference.
Yeah, wonderful. So you guys will have to check them out. I'm sure that the team is putting all of those links into the chat for you. The next question, we have a lot here, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. It says, it's anonymous, and it says, United Nations reported in a study from 100 plus scientists that a plant-based diet is necessary for us to combat climate change. The land cannot sustainably support Western society's demand for meat and dairy. What comments do you have on that? Maybe I'll let you talk first, Steve, and then open it up to everybody else.
Yeah, there's absolutely no denying that the global consumption patterns have to change. And again, here we're talking about Canadian grasslands particularly. Those stats are coming from global consumption patterns, and there's absolutely no denying that. And I'm also not saying that Canadian beef industry can't improve. It has to improve, and it needs to do better. But one thing it really struck me when I was going to all these ranches and meeting the ranchers was that there's actually no beef industry. It's all independent ranchers, family business, independent owners who are trying to make a living. Like they just eke out a living. The agribusinesses, corporations take over 95% of the actual revenue that comes out of these services. And if we think about what the ranchers do, and Ben explained it, they're conservationists. Right? This is what park rangers are supposed to be doing, and they're providing ecological services to Canadians for free, right? And there needs to be market and incentivizing for people to continue doing that. And beef has been one of the ways that they were incentivized to continue to be able to provide those ecological services. And if that's not going to be enough, then I don't know. We need to pay for that ecological service in some way. Right. So, and if that's a public good, public service to all Canadians, then Canadians ought to be paying for that collectively in some way. I've heard some, like policy proposals around that. It's too much for my head, but, there's got to, Canadian specific context is slightly different. It does need to do better, but it's very hard to point fingers at ranchers and say that it's a much larger systemic issue, specifically here in Canada.
Yeah, and just from our personal experience, first of all, you're so right. Most of the ranches and farms you will see in Canada, may it be beef industry or not, are actually family owned and operated. However, because Ben and I both work in the industry quite vastly across Canada, it's really interesting to see so many efforts being made now on soil conservation and really digging into that next layer of what it means to be a rancher. So I'd like to also see if anybody else on the panel would like to answer the question too. Carla, would you like to give your opinion on it?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, when I hear those arguments, and as Steve has pointed out, yeah, I think certainly when we think about things globally, we need to think about how we have a food system that has less impact on the earth. But when we think about the beef industry in Canada, we're the cattle there are grazing grasslands that have always been there. It's not like we're thinking about South America, for example, where we're moving Amazon rainforest in order to plant grass in order to graze cattle there. So it's different. And so when I hear those comments, I worry about what that might mean for the cattle industry and the ranchers and farmers across Canada. And if it impacts them negatively and they're no longer able to make a living in the beef industry, what is going to happen to those grasslands? They still need to make a living. So they need to make a living off that land that they own. And will those grasslands be lost to annual cropland to produce, protein to go into, pea burgers, for example, So that's what really worries me, is that it's not such a black and white issue. People really need to understand the whole food system.
Well, and that's a really important point, Carla. And I don't know if Catherine, you maybe want to speak to this or yourself, Carla, but I think that brings up an important discussion too, that actually I never had answered during the film, but I would love one of you to be able to answer it. If that land is converted, all the animals and the species at risk that are currently using that as their homes, what happens to them? Do they move to tame pasture, or what happens to them if their habitat was to disappear, I suppose?
I think Sarah, sorry, Carla.
No, go ahead, Catherine.
Go ahead, Catherine, and then we'll listen to Carla too. Yeah.
I think that's the big biodiversity crisis we're talking about, right? As more lands gets lost, species become extinct. And it's a big web, it's all interconnected. So we need that diversity. That's what makes nature resilient. That's what makes nature healthy. That really was what sustains us. So when we think that already 3/4 of the grasslands is gone, can we lose more of it? No, because if it doesn't become grazed anymore, then it'll be turned to development or cultivation, and then we will lose all the benefits for both biodiversity and fighting climate change. So really trying to sustain this economy is absolutely critical for conservation. And that's what we've learned, is how conservation and working landscape can go hand in hand. It's actually benefiting the ecosystem, which is then in turn benefiting us, right? We keep saying that nature is our biggest ally for most of societal change. But we need nature to be healthy in order to do that.
Maybe I'll just add to Catherine's point there, and we're already seeing the impacts, and that some of the birds in particular are what we call native prairie obligates. Like, they have to have native prairie. If they're displaced, they just don't do as well. So in the report, the State of Canada's Birds that came out in 2019, they reported that grassland birds in Canada have decreased by 57% since 1970. And if you dive into that even more and look at those birds that depend on native grasslands, they've declined by 87% since 1970. So, it's pretty clear that we're running out of time for some of these species.
Yeah, that's incredible. And just in case people need a reminding, Carla, how many species at risk depend on the grasslands?
I don't really have the number at the top of my head, but it spans the gamut from mammals to birds to amphibians. There's a whole range of species, and because we've lost so much grassland, native grassland, that's why we see those species so much at risk, simply because their habitat is no longer there.
Wonderful. And Catherine, do you have the actual number?
The actual number? No, yeah. It's more than 70%, of the species at risk in the country that are in our native prairies.
Yeah. Well, we'll move on to the next question. It comes from Jack, and it says, much of the grassland acreage is not suitable for annual crops because of topography, moisture, and other factors. Grass is the best use, and cattle are the way that both the environment and the ecosystem can benefit. Ben, would you like to speak a little bit to whether this is your experience with farming in this area.
Yeah, I mean, like everyone said, the grasslands are in a crisis, and we need to conserve as much as possible. One thing that's like just magic about cattle is that they're ruminants, which means that they're able to eat things that we can't eat and take something that has no nutritional value to us. Like, so I don't know if everyone can see the background, but any like grassland, like I can't go out there and just start picking handfuls of grass and derive nutrition from that for myself. But cattle can take that and get calories out of that and convert that into something that I can eat and get calories from without damaging or taking away from that ecosystem. And in fact, by improving that, because if you removed cattle, it will become a sick ecosystem. So by having large ruminants, large herds of large ruminants on those grasslands, you're able to extract calories to feed people without damaging those ecosystems. And that is just like a trifecta of a perfect scenario, and that can't happen everywhere. So there's lots of places that are just ideal for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we have a question from Michaela. It says, why is it that prairies cannot recover from after cultivation? What is the major difference between native prairies and other ecosystems that have been able to recover? So maybe, I don't know who wants to tackle this. Do we have a volunteer, or do we want to maybe start with Catherine or Carla once again?
Can I just say one thing before the actual experts weigh in and I'll look like a fool? I'd rather just speak small and first. Is that we have a biased view as humans of what something is, and we only see what we can see. And so you would look at a grassland and you can think, well, it's a bunch of dirt with plants. And so if we just cultivate it up and we grow whatever on there for 10 years or 50 years, then why don't we just take the seeds of those original things and then just put them back and it'll just grow again. But that's sort of like saying, like in my house that I'm in, well, if I took a bulldozer and pushed my house into a pile for 50 years, and then I pushed the pile back into the same spot, it has all the same components. So can't he just go live in that house again? And underground is an ecosystem that is alive with structure and animals and networks, things that depend on other things in order to be alive. And so then to say, well, we'll just put it back the way it was, is really like a childlike view of the complexity of the world that we live in.
Well, I think that's a great description, Ben. And maybe somebody, one of the experts now, can maybe talk a little bit about, which Ben's an expert too, by the way. He has dug into soil and done a lot of courses too. But I would like to actually get a perception of just like, to help people have an idea, how long would it take to try and rejuvenate the grasslands? If we all left planet Earth and the land was left to its own devices, what would it take to get it back to the way it was?
Well, I'm not sure I'm any expert, and I think Ben's analogy is actually perfect because it really does sort of capture the essence of it. And I'm not sure we know. I mean, I'm not sure we really know how long, or if, when would it return? Will it return? I mean, it's evolved under a very specific kind of regime, and would it come back? I don't know. So that's why we become so concerned about when we actually lose native grassland. It's pretty much impossible, at least in our lifetimes, to see it come back.
Yeah, that's what I would say. The answer is almost impossible, right? That's why we keep saying protecting intact is what's best. Restoration comes after. There's places where we absolutely need to do restoration, but we have to protect the best, protect what's left. I think that is the critical.
Well, and I was going to ask Steve's opinion on this. Steve, you have explored a lot of the world and really went and dove into the environment. Ben in the film likens this, likens the underground and the soil to the Amazon rainforest. And just in your opinion, and after some of your research, is what we see in the Canadian prairies, is that our Amazon rainforest? Is that similar? And I know people don't really liken, I think it's hard just to give you a description as somebody who travels Highway 2 a lot in Alberta. It's really hard as somebody who might not have an understanding of the prairie grasslands, what's the difference between this green field and this grassland? And so can you sort of, explain the importance of the biodiversity and what that means to us as Canadians in terms of our environmental stature or the impact of that in our country?
Yeah, I won't be able to really comment on the biodiversity or the conservation aspect of it. I'm by no means an expert on this. I can really speak from just my experience of having visited. I spent about a couple of weeks in the Amazon rainforest back in 2012, and then I visited all these ranches and spent time traveling. I actually drove 160,000 kilometers in the span of 3 years, going across all these places in Canada, and it's impossible for me. It's impossible to compare the two. They're very different. But what I can say is we have no control over the Amazon rainforest, right? That's in Brazil. That's in someone else's country. I can't really control that. I can complain and mourn about it. I can't really do something about that. But what I can do is right here, where I can exercise my civic and democratic, responsibilities to protect and steward what we do have. Then I would assume my responsibility is better focused on what is inherited to me as opposed to something else. And yes, we should focus on that too, and we should raise our voices, but this is something we can actually do something about. So,
well, and I was going to ask you about that, Steve, just in the sense of when you traveled across to all the different schools and you were speaking to so many individuals, do you believe there's an awareness about what is the world's most endangered ecosystem in Canada?
Absolutely not. And not even that. I mean, even in rural Alberta, students don't know what the benefits of grasslands are, or that there is an ecosystem underneath. And that's something you actually need to learn. And city people absolutely have no clue. So there really needs to be an education, and I mean this film is one of that. But again, this kind of goes back to there's not really a beef industry. If there was an industry, you'd see advertisements and marketing material all over the place already. It's one of the evidence that there really isn't a coordinated, massive industry behind it. But yeah, there needs to be far better and far more frequent, constant communication about the benefits of well-managed grasslands in Canada.
Wonderful. We'll take another question from Christy. She says, I'm wondering about the opportunities for habitat restoration and how a city dweller could get involved in that. On a different note, I'm fully in favor of grass-fed beef, but what about the impacts of feedlots? So I'm going to actually turn this over first to you, Steve, in your experience with your tours across Canada. I do know you did go to some feedlots. Then I'm going to have it turned over to Ben Campbell. So how about you, Steve?
Again, this is from my experience of having visited. The feedlot is generally what normal city people think about as beef production, right? The calf are born and raised in this tiny little jail cell, and they just eat and they grow the protein and they're slaughtered, and that's it. And there are actually terrible places like that around the world. But again, Canada, it economically makes no sense to raise the cattle like that from beginning to the end when you have all this land that's perfect for cattle grazing. And yes, I do understand that kind of you finish in the feedlot. So at the end, you go there, fatten it up, and then they get slaughtered and then shipped off. But I don't know kind of what the environmental benefit or impact of having that versus trying to finish it all the way to the end. I did actually speak to ranchers about this, and it comes back to the economic incentives for the rancher, because if you finish if you finish the cattle until the very end just with grass, then apparently they don't fatten up as much. Then you can't sell the cow as high price. Then you need to sell it at a premium price, but there isn't that much market for it, and apparently you need to sell like different parts of the cow, and that's difficult to do that when you try to anyway. So
it's a complex system, Steve, and I think that's where I want to turn this over to Ben, because a lot of times there's misinformation about like Steve was mentioning, where people have this idea of a big factory farm where a cow at a young age is pushed into a feedlot. Ben, do you want to sort of describe a little bit about how, as short as you can make it, the beef system actually works, and how long a cow actually, or an animal, is actually in a feedlot system? And then I would like to actually share my own thoughts. So I'll turn it over to you first, Ben.
Yeah, this is like a huge question. So I've got cattle on my place, and sometimes cattle will go in and out of feedlots. So they'll be born in the spring as babies, and then in the late fall, they can go to a feedlot where they're not really fed much grain. They're mostly fed harvested grasses. And then over the course of the winter, that's what they're fed. Then they go back out to the grass in the summer. And then in the fall, again, sent to a feedlot and finished on a high grain ration. And then they're fattened up. Or they can go from the winter, instead of spending the summer on grass, they can go, when they're a year old, they can go straight to a feedlot if they're big enough. Those are kind of the things. My ranch actually is a perfect example of both. So I have around 300 head of cattle on my place. 265 are yearlings that are born a year ago. They're going to be grazing until October, and then they're going to a feedlot. I'll be selling them to a feedlot. And then I've got about 35 that are part of my direct market grass-fed and finished program. They don't go to a feedlot ever, and they're sold directly to consumers. If I could sell 300 that way, I would, but there's just not a market for that. It's a more expensive way to produce beef. I think it's a more environmentally friendly way to produce beef, but you can only do what people will buy. Like if I go bankrupt, I lose my opportunity to manage this ranch, and someone else is going to manage it. And I want to manage it in the best way that I can, which means that I have to still be owning it and running it. Well, feedlots do. I just want to say feedlots do matter. The beef industry, it's not like cows are good for the environment if they're from Canada. Cows are bad for the environment if they're not from Canada. It's not black and white like that. It's that cattle managed properly can be good for the environment, and cattle managed poorly can be bad for the environment. And cattle that are in feedlots are being fed barley that's grown in a field that used to be grasslands, that was cultivated to grow grain to feed cattle. And so it's not a black and white thing that one thing is perfect and everything else is bad. That's just me being as honest as I can about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important statement to make. The focus here has been obviously grasslands, but there's also ranchers all across Canada that do a lot of conservation work on tame pasture and on land that is really crucial and important, like the grasslands. Just it has already been tilled and is used in a different way. From my own personal experience on the feedlot, I'm really interested. I think that's something we're going to tackle next in another documentary for ourselves. It has been so eye-opening to us just how crucial some of the role is that the feedlot producers play in the Canadian beef system. And And when you look at it, what's really incredible to me, as somebody who has traveled to a lot of them, is there's a lot of new relationships and old relationships that are being built around things like upcycling food that consumers don't want from grocery stores that end up going to the cattle market instead of going to a landfill. And we've been diving into this and doing stories on this. Another thing to understand about feedlot producers is most of them are, or everyone I've been to, is actually family owned and operated too. And they really have sort of a symbiotic relationship between what they do in the feedlot and how they use that nutrient cycling on the ground. And then also, it's just a really important story in terms of showing the full beef system. So we really hope to tackle that issue and that story, not issue, but story, in the coming months. So if you have any questions, we'd love you to send them to Story Brokers, and we will investigate it on your behalf. The next one, a question that we have, is from Andrea. What do you think the general public's biggest aha moment will be from this film? And how can we turn the tide for people's perceptions about beef, especially as produced in Canada, from contributor to climate change to its role as a solution? So who would like to tackle that one? Does anybody want to talk about what the aha moment was of the film and how we can get this message out further? Carla, we'll have you. Yeah.
Sure, I can start. Well, I think the film tells the untold story of grasslands by showcasing the benefits that these areas provide to our environment and to all Canadians. And I think it really highlights the critical role that ranching and beef producers have in maintaining these grasslands that maybe people didn't understand. And it gives maybe viewers an opportunity to think about, okay, well, what is the best use of that land there? And how can we ensure that that grass stays there? So, the work that you guys did with talking to some of the ranchers in the area, I think it'll show Canadians how passionate they are about that landscape and how much they care about it.
That's an awesome answer. Thank you, Carla. And I think that really, we're getting to the end of our hour-long presentation here and discussion. So I think that's a perfect segue into asking all of our panelists for their final thoughts. I would love to know if you guys have a message for Canadians who are watching today that you would like them to take home with them and consider as they go back to their families and their communities, and hopefully share the message of Canadian grasslands. So we'll start with you, Steve.
We need to be able to reward ranchers for what they do. If we don't want increased beef production to do that, we need to compensate them in a different way then. And of course people need to learn and be educated about it, but they need to be compensated for what they actually do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Carla, would you like to now answer that question too?
Sure, happy to. I think we're living in a historic moment. We are facing a biodiversity and a climate crisis, and we really need to work together to lead Canada into a new sustainable economy. And by agriculture and conservation working together, we can continue setting a powerful example on how to protect the environment and how to find solutions that will address the very real challenges that are facing us. And, we're very proud within Ducks Unlimited Canada of the progress the Canadian beef producers are making, and we're very proud to stand alongside of them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carla, for joining us today. Ben.
I think about people say, like, what's the value of the grasslands? And, why does it matter if we just cultivate it or we get rid of it? And I sort of think of that as like cultivating the grasslands is like burning the Mona Lisa or burning a library full of original manuscripts. It's a unique one-off thing that you can't ever recreate and can't get back. I think about my legacy for my kids. It's an emotional thing for me to say, but it's not money in the bank when I die. It's a community of people that love and protect nature. And ranchers have a really good thing. When you lend something to a rancher, you lend them your truck, they return it with a full tank of gas, and you return something in better condition than you borrowed it. And I'm borrowing this land from the next generation.
And you're doing a fantastic job, Ben. If you guys ever have a chance, and if Ben's willing, his ranch is amazing to go to. And his family is one of the most beautiful families you'll ever meet. Curly little redhead boys. Thank you, Ben, for coming with us today. We appreciate it. Catherine, I would love to hear your final thoughts.
Well, I think the first thing people will take is how grasslands are superpower ecosystem, right? I don't know how to call it, but it's something super special that we as Canadians take for granted. And I think Ben said it really well, but how there's a real special relationship with cattle in this ecosystem, and cattle can not only share this ecosystem in a really healthy way, but actually benefit it. So if we could learn that, I think it's a really, really important lesson. And I think finally, the solution is about this dynamic collaboration, right? I hear a guy like Ben talking about his ranch, and I hear Carla and us trying to work for conservation. And I do see how we could work together to actually save what is left. And I think this dynamic collaboration of people coming from different angle, but working together is what will provide the solution we need, because we need to accelerate. With the crisis there, and I think we've all been doing great things, but at this pace, we won't make it. So the solutions are working together, I think, to get it done.
Well, thank you so much for those comments, Catherine. And I love that you just said that, because I think that's my most important message for me to leave with is we all play a role in saving these grasslands. And it's not just the conservation groups and the ranchers like Ben. It's going to take an effort from all Canadians. And so what I want to leave everybody with tonight is, I think that the film is in the chat. We would love you to share the film. However, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to share the message of the grasslands and the importance of us conserving them. If you choose to do that through the film, that's wonderful and that's great. However, it's going to take all of our efforts. The grasslands need us, and they've done so much for us. So I encourage you all to share this message, to share it with people, your community, your friends, and with your government officials. And I want to thank everybody for participating in tonight's conversation and watching the film. We wish you well, and if you have any questions, you can continue to ask them on the Guardians of the Grasslands page, or to connect with one of our amazing panelists in their organizations. So thank you, and we wish you a beautiful evening.
Thanks for having us.
Guys.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, everybody.